Hello there. Today we are talking to Dr. Jennifer Pharr. She is an associate professor for the School of Public Health at UNLV, and she's here today to discuss current trans issues in health law. Welcome, Dr. Pharr. Why don't you start by telling me a little bit about yourself and your background?
Sure. Yeah. Thank you. Thanks for having me today.
Mm-hmm.
So a little bit about myself. As you said, I'm an associate professor of public health. It took me a little while to get there, to get to be a professor of public health. My undergraduate's in nutrition. My master's is in exercise physiology. I spent 15 years working in healthcare before I went back to school to get my PhD. I did cardiac rehab, worked in cardiology. In the last 5 years, I was a healthcare administrator. After 5 years of that glamorous career, I decided to change and went back to school to get my PhD in what I thought was going to be healthcare administration. But I fell in love with public health, and I since have been, in academia doing research in that area.
Oh, wonderful. Well, thank you so much for being here. Why don't we go ahead and dive right in? Tell me a little bit about what some of the legal issues in the area of health law that are currently impacting someone who is transgender. We could talk about either the federal level or the state level or both.
Great. Yeah. So a lot has happened in 2021 at the state level. I was reading an article the other day from ACLU talking about how 2021 is poised to be the worst year for anti-LGBTQ, but specifically anti-transgender laws. For example, 21 states have proposed, they didn't pass, but they proposed legislation that would ban pediatricians from providing care to transgender youth, gender affirming care. So what that means, gender affirming care, when we're talking about pediatric patients, we're not talking about surgery or anything like that. We're talking about providing them with maybe puberty blocking hormones. So say if a person was born male, assigned male at birth, and was a transgender female, then that person wouldn't go through puberty and develop the high levels of testosterone that most biological boys do as they go through puberty. They can block those hormones. And so the transition later in life would just be so much easier for that person. Same with, with a person that was assigned female at birth, they wouldn't go through puberty and, develop breasts and those sort of things to then have to surgically augment that later in life. So it just makes life a little bit easier for transgender youth. But then also it's something that can be easily reversed. Say at some point in time, maybe, when they become a little bit older, they think something different, right? Nothing has been done. There's nothing permanent has been done. They could just take them off of those puberty blocking hormones and they would go through puberty just like every other person does, just a little bit later in life. So these bills would keep pediatricians from being able to provide that care. One state went so far as in their proposal to say that it would be a crime for a pediatrician to provide gender affirming care. And then if parents sought gender affirming care for their children, they could be accused of child abuse and their children could be taken away from their child could be taken away from them. So it's pretty dramatic, the number of anti-transgender bills. So in 2021, 21 states proposed this legislation. 2 of the states, it's gone all the way through, right? It has to go through their state legislatures and then get signed by the governors. 2 states have had that happen. So Tennessee, the governor has signed the bill into law, and in Arkansas, that has been signed into law. So in those 2 states, transgender kids trying to seek care or pediatricians trying to provide that care won't be able to. It'll be against the law, and so their families will have to seek care someplace else.
Very interesting. Wow.
Yeah. I know Texas it should, if I had heard, that maybe the governor is waiting to sign it or something. I think Texas is going to be the 3rd state to enact this law.
Wow. And I don't necessarily have a question regarding that, but I do have a comment just basically in terms of how unique that is. It is very rare to see a statute that either compels a physician to perform a certain medical procedure or care, or the opposite, which in this case would be to stop a physician from performing a specific level of care or procedure. So I just wanted to mention how unique that is. And that doesn't typically happen in the legislature. They're not typically in the business of creating laws like this that either stop physicians from doing what they think is medically necessary, or to compel them to do something that they don't think is medically necessary. So thank you for mentioning that. I'm sorry, you can continue on. I didn't mean to interrupt. I just found that like that was the first thing I thought of when you mentioned that.
Yeah. Yeah. So, I mean, that's huge, because that, like you said, that directly is a law that will legislate how pediatricians provide care to their patients, right? I mean, then you think about that, right, in terms of your own life and seeing a doctor, right? That is such an intimate thing, right? What you and your doctor discuss, and the care, the plan of care that you and your doctor come up with for you is so unique and individual to you, right? And based on what you and your doctor think is appropriate. And to have legislators say, no, you cannot do this, physician, I think must really put physicians who are passionate about taking care of their patients, especially their transgender patient, in a very, very, very awkward position to not be able to do what they think is going to be the best thing for their patient. A few other things. A few states in 2021 have signed in religious exemptions, right? Have passed laws that grant religious exemptions. And so if LGBTQ or transgender, gay, lesbian, bisexual person went to see them and the physician found out that they were, transgender or LGBTQ, then they could refuse to provide care based on a religious exemption. So that's another thing, but that's more, the opposite way, right? So the physician doesn't feel comfortable providing care and then can refuse care, versus being told that you cannot provide care in the transgender, the pediatric bills that have been proposed. So yeah, two different ways of looking at it, but definitely 2021, there's been a lot of state laws that have been proposed. Fortunately, not all of them have passed, but have been proposed to keep from providing care for people who identify on that LGBTQ spectrum.
Okay, great. Thank you so much for that information.
Sure.
Now, just to kind of dig in a little bit further, what you mentioned the hormone blockers, right? And that might be new to some people. Is there any other type of medical care that someone who is transgender might require, and they might have difficulty accessing, something else that might fall in that category?
Sure. Yeah. So, usually the puberty blocking hormones are for pediatrics, so adolescents who are transgender. But then as someone, goes further into their life, they might need to be put on some other sort of medical therapy. So we call that gender affirming hormone therapy. So it may be that if a person is a transgender male, then they need to have testosterone as a supplement. If someone's a transgender female, and because their body doesn't produce it, right? Doesn't produce testosterone. If someone's a transgender female, then their body doesn't produce estrogen and progesterone. So they would be put on those hormones. So gender affirming hormone therapy is what they would seek. Sometimes people who are transgender, not always, it's not that you have to have some surgical intervention to then be considered transgender. In fact, just as someone identifies as being transgender without any medical therapy, they are transgender. That's how they identify. But some people feel some gender dysphoria, so some disconnect with how their physical appearance is based on how they feel or how they identify. And so then they may undergo some surgical interventions. So maybe a mastectomy to remove breast, things like that. So, can kind of run the spectrum from nothing to hormones to actual surgical interventions.
Okay. And I've often heard that type of care referred to as quote unquote life-saving. Can you tell me a little bit about why the things that we're talking about can be life-saving for transgender? Is it if they don't get this care, they'll die, or is there something else going on here?
Sure. It's not, typically it's not care like someone's having a heart attack, and if you don't give them a bypass surgery right then, they're going to die, or some, that sort of thing. But in a way, when someone inside feels a certain gender, right? So someone feels that they're a man, for example, and then they have to live their life as a woman, there's such a disconnect. It's called gender dysphoria. So like how I see myself, and then when I see myself in the mirror, these things aren't connecting for me. And that gender dysphoria actually leads to what we see as really high rates of suicide, depression. So for example, people who are transgender, identify as transgender, 40% of them have tried to commit suicide at some point in their life.
Wow.
Versus like 5% of the population, right? So
Wow.
it's not life-saving, like acute life-saving, like a bypass surgery, but it is life-saving because these medical interventions can be a way so that the person can live how they truly identify. So when they see themselves in the mirror, they see the person that they feel like they are. And so in a way, yeah, this is life-saving therapy to be able to access this sort of care.
Right. It sort of brings in the whole person aspect. It's not just the surgical intervention. There's also that mental health piece as well. And so, making sure that healthcare truly is healthcare and we're treating the entire individual. It sounds like there's a lot of interconnectivity there when a transgendered person goes to seek care.
Absolutely.
So thank you for that. Yes. And
Yeah.
then, so what would be, you mentioned that, the legislation in 21 states to prevent hormone blocker therapy in pediatric patients, but are there any other obstacles that a individual who's transgendered might face when they go to seek and access this type of care that we've talked about?
Sure. Yeah. A lot of transgender patients experience barriers sort of throughout the whole healthcare system. So some insurances in some states allow for insurance companies to not provide insurance coverage for any sort of transgender healthcare. So if you go see your doctor for a flu shot or, kind of standard care, fine, we cover that. But if you're going to see a doctor for hormone therapy or any sort of surgical intervention, we're not going to cover that, right? And so that's a barrier. That's a huge financial barrier, right? If someone feels like they need to have a vasectomy to, to feel the way they identify, but their insurance company won't pay for that, then that's thousands and thousands of dollars that the person would have to pay out of pocket. And there are several states that allow that provision to be written into an insurance policy that they won't provide transgender care. Also, whenever a transgender person is seeking care and they're seeing a physician who maybe hasn't ever had any sort of education or training about how to care for a transgender person, how to use the right pronouns, not to look at the medical record and the sex assigned at birth and then use those pronouns, to actually call the person by the pronouns that are true to that person, right? Those sort of things. Then that can be a huge barrier to care. So having physicians who just don't really know how to provide care that it doesn't make the patient feel uncomfortable or awkward, or like they want to hide part of themselves. Like maybe they don't want to reveal that they're a transgender person because they don't want to feel discriminated against or things like that. There's a huge survey that they did in 2015. 27,000 transgender people answered the survey. And they asked questions about discrimination in the healthcare setting, things like physical abuse, verbal abuse, being denied care. And it's surprising how many transgender people have experienced those things. And all of those things become really big barriers to care when, even just going to a doctor for a simple thing like, the flu or something, they may not be able to just be their whole person and bring their whole person into the medical environment.
Wow. So there's the structural piece, of having a system set up, like, for example, in the health insurance industry, where these different policies may exclude care or exclude coverage for different types of care. And that's being allowed, through the legal system. And then there's the sort of personal piece, right, where the stigma of not knowing exactly how to interact with someone who is transgender, or even understanding their needs, that might definitely interrupt care. And so that could definitely be an issue.
Yeah.
Okay. So here we are. We're 2022, and what do you think, or what do you see is the next big legal hurdle for the rights of transgendered individuals? Where are we going next? What's the next battle?
Yeah, looking at 2021, it's sort of shocking, and I hope that 2022 is a little bit better as far as state policy and things go. One of the big, even bigger than the legislation trying to ban pediatricians from providing care, you see that in 31 states, they've introduced bills to prevent transgender athletes from participating in sport. So transgender girls and boys wouldn't be able to participate in, junior high or high school sport. Transgender men and women wouldn't be able to participate in college sports in a lot of these states. 8 of these states actually signed those bills into law. And so I guess, watching all this move, I'm afraid that some of the states where it kind of got stuck in committee and they didn't get to, go all the way through the process, that they may pick that up again in 2022. And so we just may see more and more states that are disallowing transgender students from participating in sport. And, at the same time that we may see, more states move through with the legislation to prevent pediatricians from providing care to transgender youth. And so I think that I do this type of research is going to be on how are things going in 2022. There in 2019, there was at the federal level a law that was proposed. It passed the House. It's been stuck in the Senate ever since, and it's at the federal level to protect LGBTQ people from discrimination, and it's the Equality Act.
Okay.
I hope that it's kind of a different day, right? It passed the House in 2019. We had a different president from a different political party than we do now. And so maybe as things move, maybe the Senate will be able to pass this bill. So that would give federal protections to transgender as well as lesbian, gay, bisexual, queer questioning people as well. But federal protections may be what are needed at this point to give rights to transgender people whose state has decided that they don't get those rights. So that's going to be something else that we'll be looking at to see, if this moves forward.
So the idea of that Equality Act that you're describing is to put in broader-based legal protections for transgender individuals of all ages. And the idea there is to supersede individual states and some of the restrictions that they've put into place.
Right. Yeah, it's sort of like in 2015, the Marriage Equality Act. So that allowed same-sex marriages federally, right? Even though there were a lot of states that had bans against same-sex marriage. Once it became legal at the federal level, then all of those bans sort of just, they go
everything
away,
has to
right?
fall, right? All the dominoes fall. Right?
Yeah. And so we're hoping that if the Equality Act is passed, maybe in 2022, then there would be that federal protection. And so, yes, and that would trickle down to the states. And then transgender folks would have that protection, that federal protection to be able to access care.
Okay. Well, this has been really great. Thank you so much, Dr. Pharr, for taking the time out of your busy schedule to discuss this topic with us. There's so much here, and I think it's a fantastic introduction to this, to these issues. For faculty and students who are viewing this video, you can find additional course materials and links to additional resources on the webpage where you downloaded this video. So thank you again, Dr. Pharr, and have a great day, everyone.